So I'll start with Ambassador Nuland. In your opinion, does Russia have a coherent strategy for achieving its foreign policy goals, and does it have a specific end game that it is trying to reach? What's your thoughts on that?
I think President Putin initially, as he said in 2005, sought to restore the glory and spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. But now his appetite has grown with the eating, and as I said in my testimony, he believes we are weak and he can exploit our divisions. He believes we did not respond with the kind of strength he would have expected, whether it was in Syria or Ukraine or against the INF Treaty violations or now in Venezuela. And therefore, as you said, he will take any target of opportunity to exploit and accrete into those spaces where we are not, whether it's undercutting democratic development in the Balkans, an area that the chairman and I have worked on a lot together, with corruption and those kinds of things, whether it's allying with China on digital aggression and other things. So I think he has a very coherent strategy. He wants to make the world safe for autocracy, and not just safe for it, but to make that an alternative governance model, and he wants to do that in part to stay at power at home, because he's not offering his own people better schools or better hospitals or a better economy. He has to only offer them this illusion of glory. So it's both a defensive and an offensive strategy for him, but he's not 1,000 feet tall. You know, Russia has a GDP the size of Italy and 3 times the population and 5 times the landmass. We just don't have our act together, and we need to get our act together and be stronger at home, stronger with our allies, and roll it back. And I think we can, and give the Russian people another set of choices and call them to question whether they are actually living better in this system that he's offered.
Ambassador Fried.
I agree with what Ambassador Nuland said, and I'd like to build on it. Putin is an opportunist, and his theory of autocrats can make progress because we've pulled ourselves out of the game. We need to remember that our strength was derived from our association and leadership of the free world. That is, we understood that values and interests ultimately were the same. That was our big strategic breakthrough decades ago. And we need to remember this, because when we're spending, the Trump administration is right that we've re-entered a period of great power rivalry. But then, for God's sakes, let's align ourselves with our friends, the better to deal with our adversaries. We waste too much political capital in ideological fights with the European Union. Look, the European Union can be a headache, but they're not our problem. They're not a strategic rival. We need to align ourselves with our friends on behalf of our values. And when we start doing that, we can push back most effectively against Putinism. Because as Ambassador Nuland said, he offers power and not betterment of his own people. And we won the Cold War when it became clear that the Soviet Union offered nothing but chaos and poverty, and that to its own people. And we need to get back that vision of ourselves.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being here today. Ambassador Fried, with your background, having been ambassador to Poland, could you, the question that Congressman Smith had proposed relative to our association with that NATO ally, can you expound on this?
Happily, I spent many years in Poland. The Trump administration is right to be talking with the Poles about increasing the U.S. military presence there. It's not just a bilateral deal. We need to do this within the NATO framework, and the Poles understand this. And this is, I should add that this is bipartisan in Poland. The government supports it. It's a conservative government. The liberal opposition supports it. I've asked them. This is the right thing to do. And it needs to be taken out of, it needs to be put, our military presence in Poland needs to be put in a context of a united West, NATO, the US and the EU, standing for our values of democracy, and defending NATO allies. This is the right thing to do. I appreciate what the Trump administration is doing. I think they ought to, I hope they close a deal. I really do.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Nuland and General Keane, in line with Congressman Meeks, the interference of strategy of Russia to interfere in elections, with the most recent elections in Ukraine, what is your assessment of the interference, and did it have an outcome, Ambassador Nuland?
Well, interestingly, in the latest Ukrainian elections, the Russians had almost no influence. They didn't have a candidate. As you saw, the outsider won an overwhelming majority all across the country, in part because the citizenry doesn't think that there's been enough change in the anti-corruption side and saw the other candidates as representatives of the old guard. So it's interesting to watch Moscow unsure how to work with President-elect Zelensky. I think we need to offer Ukraine strong support and get in there with Zelensky when he sits and encourage further reform, particularly on the anti-corruption side, and continue to tie our assistance to Ukraine to positive development there. The greatest nightmare for Russia is a successful Ukraine, because then they will have a neighbor at their door that is democratic, and not to mention the example that Ukraine sets with democratic alternation of power that could not be manipulated from the presidency. That's something Russia hasn't seen in a long time.
Thank you, General.
Yes, dealing with Ukraine, I really think Putin has sort of got a wait-and-see attitude with it. I mean, obviously he's directly involved, but he's also exercising some patience, because I think he fundamentally believes, given the problems that Poroshenko had in this election, so resoundingly defeated, you know, the domestic reforms were never really put in place. He's tied to corruption himself personally. And now we have someone with no political experience whatsoever who's running the country. While that may have not have been Putin's choice, I think he looks at it very favorably. And if the government cannot really produce a degree of political stability and also a degree of economic viability and prosperity, Putin, it's on his side. He'd be able to wait this thing out and achieve what his national interests are. I firmly believe that we've got to be more involved than what we currently are in terms of politically, diplomatically, and also militarily, in terms of helping their military forces. So yes, and in terms of our own election, I'll take it at face value. It didn't impact on the election, but I don't believe that that's the only goal that Putin has when he's meddling in elections in France and Brexit in the United States and in other countries. He's really seeking to undermine the democratic and political process. And given what happened in our country with investigations that are still going on as the Congress is meeting today, and the significant political divisions that we have in our country as a result of his meddling, he probably thinks that's a major victory for himself and encourages him to do even more of it.
And thank each of you for your being here today and your insight, and we appreciate your service to our country.
Thank you. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to underscore your comments in terms of the outrage of holding Paul Whelan for no legal reasons whatsoever in Russia. And also, I just want to comment briefly, I find it extraordinary that the top-line message of all of our witnesses today is that we're absent the resolve as a country right now in having a consistent Russia policy. I think that's something that's so obvious by your testimony, but really has to be highlighted. We have to do better than this as a country. Now, let me probe a little more deeply in things you touched upon. Could you tell us, any of you, that the relationship you've seen with, like, Deutsche Bank, dealing with the oligarchs and that relationship, anything you might want to comment about that kind of financial relationship with, really, the power brokers of Russia, the oligarchs, plus, if you comment on Putin's use of the VEB bank.
In my last job in government, I was the State Department sanctions coordinator, so I got into some of these issues. We've seen, there's plenty of evidence that the Russians and Putin uses the Western financial system to launder money and park it. They take advantage of our system because they trust our banking system more than they trust their own. We should start drawing up the channels for potentially corrupt Russian money flows. For example, why should high-end real estate deals be allowed to exist without full disclosure of the beneficial owner? That means that Russian secret money can flow into New York or Miami or London or various places in Europe without any kind of oversight.
And we can do something stronger than what
Sure.
we're doing now to influence that. Make sure, for instance, there's compliance with our request for banks like this that might be conducting themselves this way right now.
Well, I also believe that there are regulatory and legislative changes that could mandate disclosure of beneficial owners in high-end real estate deals.
You also, what message, the VE Bank, is it safe to say, fair to say, that's Putin's bank, basically? That he has enormous influence. Is that fair to say, fair statement? What message are we getting when past and current members of the Trump administration or campaign are meeting with the head of that bank in secret meetings? What message does that send back to Russia?
In general, and without getting into the specifics, I think it is good to send the Russians a message that we don't appreciate what they're doing, and passing that message also to the heads of the big state Russian banks.
Okay, I just want to shift gears too. We have something that Russia doesn't have, for that matter, China, but we have a coalition. So in my subcommittee of this committee, I'm going to have a laser-like view on strengthening that coalition. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Europe, met with our officials, and happy to report that the strength we have together with NATO is still vibrant. It's still formidable. It's obviously important. But there's no mistaking that Russia is using significant resources in Central Europe and the Balkans to extend their influence. And yet, they seem to have these relationships with Viktor Orban and Hungary, with Erdogan and Turkey, which is a great concern, and even influence in Serbia. That's something that, if you could spend the rest of my time just commenting on briefly, because I think that's a concern. We want to keep this strong, and they're trying to divide us.
We need, with respect to Central Europe, we need to be active and present. I don't like a lot of what Viktor Orban has said about the Russians, but I don't regard Hungary as a lost cause. I think we need to show up. I think we need to be present in that space. I think that the Russian aggression has spoiled their relations with even some of their more traditional friends.
Ambassador Nuland, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but I'd like to welcome anything you have to say in that regard.
Thanks, Congressman Keating. As you and I have discussed privately, we know a lot about Russian money sloshing around Eastern Europe and the Balkans. We know a lot about its corrupting influence. I think it's time to shine a light on that and expose those who take it and expose the Kremlin's use of the Russian taxpayers' money for malign purposes.
Great. Thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the panel. We're privileged to have folks of your breadth and scope of knowledge. I want to start out with a basic premise just to see if I can set the table and then go through some rhetorical questions to set up a question here. To me, contrary to popular belief, Russia really doesn't have a particular preference of which party in the United States. Their goal, I think, is to cause discord and spread disinformation and make people in America generally distrust our political system. Does anybody vehemently disagree with that? Any of the panel members? No, I'm not seeing any big yeses. So with that, these are the rhetorical questions. How was it in, let me preface it with this. Every one of us here is probably disappointed in every administration's response to some of this stuff at some level. However, I think it's important to kind of correct the record over the long term here. How was it in the United States' interest to not realize the full extent of Russian influence operations and then the reluctance to act until after the election? How was that in America's interest? How was it in America's interest to do almost nothing of import and effectiveness regarding Ukraine and Crimea, regarding a resurgent Russia? How was it in America's interest to happily cut our military capability and telegraph that all around the world? How was it in our interest to scale back missile defense plans in Europe? How was it in our interest to allow Russia to play a pivotal role in the Iran nuclear agreement? And it wasn't in our interest, I don't think, to fail to get a multilateral agreement with Russia on the Syrian civil war. How was it our interest to, when the previous president said to Medvedev that he just needed a little more time regarding missiles and our missile capability in Europe? How did it serve America to have the sale of U.S. uranium capability? And how did it serve America's interest to provide access to Russia regarding technology, including hypersonic cruise missile technology at Skolkovo? That was the previous, that's all the previous administration. And like I said, there's frustration on both sides. I wonder how long that Russia has been suspected of violating all the missile agreements that we've, and nuclear or arms agreement. It's been since we've had them, essentially, right? So my question essentially is this, and Ambassador Fried, I agree with you. Americans don't want to be in a fight with Russia or anybody. We would like to get along with everybody. Unfortunately, the Russians have a vote, or at least their leaders do, and they vote otherwise, right? And we have to deal with the reality of that. And I wonder, because each of you have spoken about unity, Ambassador Nuland, Ambassador Fried, about unity in the United States, and General Keane, you have as well, about our unity and our singular purpose regarding Russia. How can there be unity when some in positions of great leadership and authority continue to promulgate the narrative that this president is a traitor and a collaborator with Russia based on what has now been determined by the special counsel, millions of dollars, 2 years, subpoenas, interviews, et cetera, to be patently false? How can there be unity? How can there be unity when this body passes bills to limit this president's capabilities in Venezuela? That's just a general question. You can comment on that, any of that. Ambassador Nuland, you said a lot fast, and I wish I had your testimony, but you said something about the lesson from the Mueller report. And I think you referenced that this is the president's victory. It didn't have anything to do with Russia. And I think the assumption is that this president needs to learn that lesson and move on. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So the lesson to who? Is it to the president or to folks in the United States and in this Congress that continue to accuse the president of being a traitor and collaborating with Russia? I'm wondering who the lesson is for.
Congressman Perry, just to repeat what I said, the lesson of the Mueller report and from our intelligence community before was that Putin seeks, as you said, to pit Americans against each other, to destroy our democratic system, to erode trust. So what I was trying to say was, I think we are all seeking stronger presidential leadership vis-a-vis the Kremlin to ensure that he cannot do it again in 2020, in 2022, in 2024, starting with some stronger statements. And I would like to have stronger statements about Russian activities in Venezuela and in Ukraine and in Syria. That would be a start, and it would change Putin's calculus immediately. And then if we had actual actions to strengthen ourselves and make it cost for him from this White House, that would also begin to reverse the balance.
I think you will find few people up here on either side that would object to that. But would you agree that this president has been limited by the anchor that's been placed around his neck and thrown to the bottom of the ocean with this whole Russian collusion? You're a traitor, and you're working with them to undermine the United States, and that anything he does, even when the Russians actually come into compliance, we refuse to lift the sanctions on certain occasions in this body. Is that a limitation for this president, to this administration, in dealing with Russia effectively?
I would have argued the opposite, that if the president had taken a very strong stand against Russian aggression in our democracy from the day of his inauguration, he would have been stronger domestically as well in the context of the Mueller investigation.
Thank you.
Are you out of time?
General, I would love to hear your comment.
Well, I think that list that you presented, certainly the degree that all that happened, I suspect was a strategic surprise to Putin to a certain degree. I mean, clearly, when he came into power, he wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance for all the reasons we know so well. But then he was given, I think, an opportunity as the United States was disengaging to pursue other strategic objectives. And that is why he's in the Middle East. That is why he's aggressively in Africa. And now he's also in the Western Hemisphere. As Ambassador Fried said, he's an opportunist. He's smart, he thinks strategically, and he's taken advantage of the playing field. And that's what we're facing. Now, I think it's a mistake to assume that because President Trump desires to have a personal relationship with Putin as a result of his diplomatic efforts, that the United States is not pushing back on Russia. When you look at the policy, they are. What we're suggesting, and certainly what I'm suggesting, is we can do considerably better than where we are right now. Much more comprehensively, much more strategically, and much more involved with our allies in doing it.
Thank you, General. Mr. Phillips.